In preparation for the Russian presidential election this month, Putin has promised to adjust the country's economic grievances in his next term. However, how he plans to implement reforms is yet to be determined, as two rival groups are working on conflicting roadmaps. My name is Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Russia's wave of economic grievances accelerated in the years between 2014 and 2016 when the country experienced two financial complications. First, the price of crude oil, which is the core substance of the Russian economy, declined from $108 in September 2013 to nearly $30 in February 2016. Second, Western sanctions on Russian banks and energy firms, which were in response to the Kremlin's annexation of Crimea, crippled investment in the country. As a result, Putin's government used Russia's sovereign wealth funds to cover the budget deficits. But in the process, the government has nearly depleted its capital reserves. In recent years, a dozen regional authorities have drowned themselves in debt, while the central government in Moscow has maintained a low national debt level. The poor economic conditions in the regional administrations are so severe that in 2017, many of them failed to pay the federal taxes to Moscow. In response, the Kremlin purged a record 19 governors. What's more is that hundreds of banks have been nationalized and closed all over the country due to the rampant corruption and the incompetence in the regional administrations. In response to the shortages, Moscow took on more responsibility and centralized the economy. Between 2008 and 2017, the average economic growth in Russia was about 1%. This is substantially lower than the growth in the Eurozone and the United States. Due to the underperformance in the last decade, Russian policymakers are working on roadmaps to revitalize the economy. However, there are two rival schools of thought. Former Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin, who has worked with Putin since the 1990s, leads the liberal faction. Together with the CEO of Sberbank Herman Gref and the chairwoman of the central bank Elvira Nabiullina, Kudrin wants to liberalize Russia's economy and decrease the role of Moscow. The liberals believe that the highly centralized bureaucracy deters investment in the country. As such, Kudrin has proposed to channel military and security funds, which has skyrocketed in recent years, towards healthcare and education. The idea is that if Russians can work longer and gain better skills, it will improve the economy. In essence, Kudrin and his allies argue that Russia can only attract investment by making its private sector more appealing. Currently, Kudrin is working on an economic roadmap for Putin's next term. Among his proposals is to reform taxes on new businesses, decrease Moscow's bureaucracy, improve law enforcement, confront corruption, bolster the infrastructure, modernize manufacturing industries, and create a more sustainable pension system. Although the liberal group has powerful ties to the Kremlin, they are rivaled by the conservatives and state-owned businesses. This group is led by Boris Titov, and they believe that the privatization program and the reforms of Kudrin would encourage social unrest across the country. As a counter-proposal, Titov wants the government to take an even greater role to protect national security. More specifically, he believes that investment in Russia should come from the government, not from foreign multinational companies. To that end, Titov wants Moscow to sharply reduce interest rates to enable the central bank to print more money and subsequently take on more debt. The idea is that this would allow state-owned companies to borrow funds with a discount and invest that money in their respective industries. This proposal for state-backed investment is supported by most oligarchs and industrialists, as they stand to gain significantly from government-funded infusions of credit. In response to Titov's plan, Kudrin argues that such motions would drastically devaluate the ruble and allow for inflation to surge past acceptable levels. Essentially, the proposals by Kudrin and Titov contradict one another, and it's uncertain whose advice Putin will heed in his next term. Yet modern Russia's economy is inherently linked to the country's political system. The truth is that the Russians have always put political security above financial growth. This economic policy, known as Putinomics, can be examined in three dimensions. The first aspect of Putinomics is to maintain macroeconomic stability at all costs. This means low budget deficit, low inflation, and low levels of debt. Having experienced the economic meltdown of the 1990s, Russian policymakers know very well that a budget crisis can destroy a president's popularity and even topple governments. When Putin first took office, he committed a large chunk of Russia's energy revenues to pay back the country's foreign debt ahead of schedule. Even with the fall of crude oil prices, the Russian government maintains a budget deficit of about 1% of GDP, which is far lower than in the Eurozone. This is mostly possible due to the harsh austerity measures. Putin also supported the central bank's increase in interest rates, which restrained inflation but also limited GDP growth. Putin's financial advisors argue that the Russian people want financial stability above all else. The second aspect of Putinomics is to prevent social unrest by assuring labor market stability, such as steady pensions and low unemployment. In the 1990s, salaries, social benefits, and government pensions often went unpaid for months. Not surprisingly, it led to protests and contributed to Yeltsin's political discredit. When the most recent crisis hit Russia, the government chose to decrease minimum wage by 10% rather than allow unemployment to rise. By comparison to the West, in the aftermath of the 2008 recession, average salaries in the United States maintained the same levels, but people were laid off. So again, the narrative in Moscow is that cutting wages is preferable to mass layoffs. The rationale is that the Russian people are more likely to protest factory closures than salary cuts. The preference of politics over economics also determines Russia's social benefits policy. Putin has dealt with the current economic crisis by reducing funds for education and healthcare to keep pensions and social benefits steady. This attitude, however, has come at the expense of Russia's human capital. Money is simply not being invested in the future but is redirected to political stability. The final point of Putinomics is to allow the private sector to operate freely, but only in sectors that do not compromise the government's geopolitical policies and capabilities. This is where the Russian oligarchy comes into play. As supporters of Putin, the oligarchs who dominate the state-owned companies have embedded themselves in the government's effort to maintain a stable labor market. So industries like energy, media, military, and other businesses that intersect with politics are off limits. But someone who owns a supermarket franchise has fewer restrictions. Taken together, Putin's policies have shown that the government appreciates growth but prefers to retain power. As such, the aim of Putinomics is not to maximize household incomes and GDP. Such goals require a different set of policies. Yet, unlike many other energy-dependent nations, Putinomics has kept Russia politically stable and the ruling elite in power. In this context, the reforms by Kudrin, which are necessary for the long term, jeopardize the status quo. It could even anger some important groups who have vested interests in government-funded infusions of credit. Kudrin's reforms could even loosen Putin's hold on power. Meanwhile, Titov's outline for greater government investment will keep the political system stable but in contraction, as human capital and the private sector will remain neglected while vast amounts of credits are wasted on corrupt state-owned companies. It's entirely possible that Titov's plan could double the GDP growth, but there is also a chance that it would boost inflation and crash the ruble. By comparison, Kudrin's reforms to invest in human capital and improve the private sector is more sensible. But to acquire the necessary funds without gaining additional debts, Putin will have to relocate spending from the security services and the military toward education and healthcare. Clearly, this does not sit well with the Russian military-industrial complex and the state-owned companies, which are some of the strongest backers of Putin. It's not exactly a group that the president wants to upset, since doing so would undermine his own political coalition. Moreover, the military-industrial complex and the state-owned companies control about 2/3 of the economy. They also provide employment to millions of Russians. So Moscow's military and security spending is not just to fund foreign conflicts, but like its American counterpart, the Russian military-industrial complex and the state-owned companies form the backbone of Russia's economy. If Putin decreased military and security spending, not only would the exposed groups defend what they consider is their turf, but it would risk layoffs and thereby increase social unrest. The arrangement between the government and the military-industrial complex and the state-owned companies renders the Russian leadership incapable of substantial reform. Even taking measures against corruption is not feasible. Most of the oligarchs that surround the president are enablers of corrupt dealings, as their business practices depend on extortion and monopoly power. According to the parameters of Putinomics, the conflicting reforms of Kudrin and Titov both present unacceptable risks. The president has built a hard-earned reputation as the provider of political and economic stability. If the reforms fail, the public will blame Putin. Considering all of this, the most likely outcome is that in his next term, Putin implements partial reforms from both camps. Yet this will not be enough to substantially change the system. By comparison to other emerging markets, Russia's economy will continue to underperform in 2019 and in the nearby future. The truth is that in spite of the political promises, without a complete overhaul, the Kremlin is simply incapable of economic reform. This was a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. Special thanks to our contributors on Patreon, who give us the resources to continue our work and remain self-sustained and independent of sponsors. If you would like to join our network, or if you're looking for more information, visit patreon.com/Caspian Report. In any case, thank you for your time, and Sarol.